I was going to try and take the video off because there's some smaller slides. Oh, there we go. Yeah, so okay.
I'll do the same. Just to say to everyone, please use the chat box. So for comments and questions, we're going to keep the questions to the end, but yeah, please use the chat box. So over to you.
Okay, I mean, me turning off the video is just my excuse for not letting you see me. I'm really living this working from home life to the max and not having a shave. Okay, so once again, thank you, Kate, for organising it. Thank you for the introduction. Good afternoon from wherever you're coming from, whether that be tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, or even tier -1, which is usually reserved for the likes of Dominic Cummins. Thanks for taking the time to tune in, and a big shout out, obviously, to Kate Mercer Training for organising this and inviting me to speak to her. Before going into the presentation, I want to give a little bit of information about my background and some of the work that I've been involved in, just to add a little bit extra to what Kate was saying, but also some context setting, some background setting to set the scene. So in terms of the race equality work, I mean, that originally started at Toxis Citizens Advice Bureau almost 20 years ago. And since then, there's been different bits of work looking at inequality in school exclusions, criminal justice, stop and search, but also within the prison. But in the last 7 years, it's been more relating to advocacy, looking at, well, more mental health involving community advocacy and devising what I'd say were culturally adapted mental health interventions in the community. So that would have been taking Western-centric models and adapting them to see how different populations, particularly from South Asia and also people from North African countries, received those interventions once they were adapted. So I mean throughout this career, there's been a number of in the last 20 years, a number of incidents, if you like, which have put race and racism in the headlines. We know early part of the 20th century, we've had the report into the Stephen Lawrence. We had the murder of Anthony Walker, the Rocky Bennett report, and also the failings in different establishments, Zaid Mubarak in youth offending institutions. And in different ways, these incidents have put the spotlight on race and racism. And I think at the moment we're operating in an environment where, you know, there's a new particular context. So we have had the Mental Health Act review, and one aspect of that has, as Kate was mentioning, made suggestions about how, you know, one of the recommendations were culturally appropriate advocacy. But at the same time, we've had the Black Lives Matters movement. This slide seems to be going through faster than what I want it to. I don't know if I've got it on a timer or something. Let's see how it goes. Okay, so a number of things are creating a context at the moment, as I was saying, and you know, since the murder of George Floyd, what we have a number of requests coming through, and they've already appeared on the screen before I wanted them to. And these are some of the requests that have really come through for training and support from a number of different organisations. So these aren't specifically advocacy organisations. So approximately 3 months ago, an employment organisation, you know, got in contact, and they wanted to support across almost all of these areas without realising that if they just had the support across, for example, critical race, they would be getting a lot of information about the other aspects as well. And then even though they wanted support across all these areas, they only had 1.5 hours for that training to be delivered. And there's been lots of other requests. So the conversations would often go along the lines of, you know, we want unconscious bias training. And my response is that, you know, why is it that you wanted to do it? Where does the evidence actually point? And what is the problem that you think you have? And this is a theme that I want to develop throughout the presentation, really, is about where does the evidence point to? What is it suggesting that you actually need? So, I mean, when we get the requests for the unconscious bias training, a lot of people don't understand that the implications of having it can be equally as dangerous as the benefits. The jury is well and truly out on how advantageous unconscious bias training actually is. And what I'm not saying it is completely useless, but it has to operate alongside a number of other ingredients, which is one of the other points that I want to make throughout this presentation. Really, is about it's not one single measure that needs to be adopted, and I find that's what people tend to be looking for. Not everyone, but there's this idea that there's a magic bullet. I mean, if I can give one example, and some of you may be aware of it, I think most people are familiar with Airbnb, but they had a problem only a couple of years ago where they identified that 16 black groups were 16% less likely to be accepted as guests from the vendors on their website. So initially they changed their policy. People had to agree to not be discriminatory, and that had a little effect. It improved it a little bit. But then they have an option where you have an instant booking, and it used to have pictures on there. They removed the pictures from the instant booking, and almost immediately the bias, the racial bias, completely evaporated, completely disappeared just by taking the pictures away. However, only 3% of the bookings were really made by the instant booking app. So what they then did was they started to use previous reviews, and the evidence so far on that one, it's still ongoing, is suggesting that it's made a difference. And the idea behind this is that when you give people concrete information, when you have that individuality, it helps to start mitigating the bias. And this is about thinking through different measures. And what I want to talk about as we go through is how some of these measures can be applied within different settings, but we really have to be reflective on our practice. You know, I mean, I've recently spoken to a fairly large mental health organisation, and they wanted to start off a BME forum. I'm not against BME forums. I think they're useful for different reasons, but they noticed it because they had inequalities. But there's research has shown that when they created a hierarchy of different interventions which are effective, the idea of BME forums and such things and networks were the least effective and probably didn't even have any effect at all. Litigation was at the top. Well, litigation was second, and continuous litigation was right at the top. This was based within a private sector. So the idea is that there being not being a single magic bullet and being a collection of different measures that can be applied. So now I'm trying to get onto my next slide. Okay, let's just press next. There we go. Okay, that'll do it for me. So the presentation is the role of advocates and the role of mitigating bias, and that's the point. Is it we're at that situation where we're not actually trying to address the bias ourselves if we're trying to make an intervention right now, because the evidence on what can actually address bias is not forthcoming. I mean, about 15 years ago, I was working with some serious racial hate crime offenders, trying lots of different interventions that would reduce the bias, and none of them really worked. The one that seemed most effective was actually restorative justice, but it didn't work for everyone. How to apply that within a mental health setting is something I haven't even thought through. But the idea that we can mitigate bias through actions and through procedures is one way that we can start to make progress, I feel, until we get a little bit further down the line. So one thing I'd be quite interested to know as we go in, there is a part where you can share your thoughts. I'm not looking at it, but I will look at it later, and just to see if you can share them where you feel bias actually operates within the system, and also, you know, what level it's actually operating at, and how advocates could play a role in that, because I'd be quite interested to be able to see that and reflect on that. So
thanks, Anthony, for that challenge. Yeah. We'll get people to do that in the chat box. Just sorry to interrupt, but a quick question around what do you mean by continuous litigation? Can you just tell?
Okay, yes, sure. So continuous litigation is quite simple. If a case has taken place where an authority's been held to account for not performing, and they haven't responded to it, then the cases could be taken against them again for the same reason or for another reason, and that is the one that has proven to be most successful against private companies, and that was particularly in the US. So I mean, one thing I was going to mention is that, I mean, I'll be mentioning a number of different studies, and I haven't put references on there, but my email address is available at the end, and if there's any studies that anything that I mention in terms of a statistic or anything like that that you'd like me to send over as the report, then please just drop me an email and I'll be happy to send them over. Is that okay, Kate? Yeah.
Sorry, I'm on mute. Yeah, that's brilliant.
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, these are the broad areas that I'd like to cover. I mean, you'd be happy that part of the death by introduction is almost done. Next part of that really is to just look through some of the existing equalities, which as you'll know, led to the Mental Health Act review. I then want to look at the scoping exercise that we carried out earlier in the year. It was a fairly short amount of time to do it. Looking at some of the findings of that, but also looking at what some of the wider literature actually says around that as well. And then looking at the final part, which is thinking through a model of culturally appropriate advocacy. Some of the In 2018, I was involved in developing a pilot program, which was a Black advocacy training program, and a lot of the hurdles that I think are relevant to how we address bias are some of the issues that we had to overcome at that moment in time. So yeah, these are the main themes that I'll be looking at over the next 40 minutes or so. Have I just missed it? I'm not doing too good with these slides today, am I? Yeah, there we go. Okay, so I don't want to spend too long on what led to the review. I think most people are familiar with it. The main reason which Theresa May said she would like to have a review of the Mental Health Act was due to some burning injustices and the rates of detentions for Black groups, in particular African Caribbean groups, was one of those reasons. But there's lots of other inequalities that you can see right throughout the system. Length of stay tends to be longer for Black groups. There's poorer rates of access and outcomes in relation to psychological interventions. That's not only within inpatient settings, but it's also in the community. It's not quite a clear-cut area. That sometimes some studies have shown that some Black groups won't access the support once they're being offered it. So that's an issue. I mean, and there's different studies which have explored whether they want that or not, whether they see it as fitting to their needs. So, and the more negative pathways into services, for me, this is absolutely crucial in terms of understanding a person's journey into services and then what takes place thereafter. I mean, we know since the 1960s that there's been a differential rate of a different way that different groups access services, and much more coercive for people who self-define as Black. And one of the groups which has now shown a greater level of disproportionality is Black women, which is quite concerning, and that's been since around 2013. So, I mean, this next slide here, sorry, this is the writing on this one's a little bit smaller, but this highlights some of the inequalities which we obtained. I think this is for 2018, 2019. The general picture is that, I mean, I've selected some different areas here, but the general picture that across the country is that there is representation. The pattern is from all of this that even though the BME groups may be higher in that area, the percentage that is detained is higher than what is in the actual local population. So, as I say, these are this is the main factor that really drove one of the main factors that drove a focus on Black and African groups in relation to the Mental Health Act review. What I would say is the data is really poor in relation to religion. It needs some significant improvement, and one of the other problems with the data that we were getting at the time was that so many people seem to be getting categorized in the unknown group, and based on my opinion and some experiences, that would actually increase the inequality of anything, because you tend not to get white British people putting themselves or self-define as unknown. So I think it's quite clear that there is overrepresentation, and that is one of the big problems. So that's what led to the scoping of culture appropriate advocacy. And this is, you'll be pleased to know, the second part of the presentation that I want to look at. But I mean, what a lot of people said is you know, culture appropriate advocacy, which is like cultural competency for those who have been around and looked at other models. It's not something that's particularly exclusive to BME groups. It is an inclusive notion, but it has a particular relevance to Black and minority communities purely because of their particular needs. So the scope and review that we carried out was looking specifically at IMHA and organisations that had also been delivering IMHA support, but also those who had previously provided it. From the initial review that before we carried it out, before we started the research, it was quite clear that there was limited evidence available on him, and none that specifically covered culturally appropriate services. As far as we were aware, there was no published literature on any competency frameworks that could be applied to advocacy services. You can see different culturally appropriate services in advocacy in the US, but no real framework that had been put together to apply how that could be moved from one context to the next, which is something that I want to talk in the next part, really, is that's one of the things that we covered when we were looking at the pilot. I mean, there has been commentary highlighting the shortfalls in advocacy for BME communities in relation to IMHA and the vulnerability of the Black and community voluntary sector more generally. So when we were carrying out the research, we asked the participants how they would really define what culturally appropriate advocacy is or was. And a lot of the responses when we put them together really defined it as a service that is able to understand and respond to the varied and individual needs of BME people. And the reason I've underlined the service there, I'll make more clear later, is it was relating to the advocacy service, not always a full reflection on the individual, but also not always a reflection of how the service could hold another service to account. And I'll talk a bit more about that as in the next phase of the presentation, if you like. And an advocacy service, a workforce that is representative of service user population, ethnically and religiously. And this is what came out time and time again. It's quite a narrow understanding, really, that if you have a workforce which is representative, then that may be part and parcel of providing a culturally appropriate service. I think, but what we know from lots of research is that, bias can still operate that way. And when you look at what they call internalized oppression, we know that people, all groups will live out stereotypes, which can then inform practice. So in terms of, now we turn to just look at some of the findings. Now, as I say, these are some of the commissioner findings, a headline of them really. What we did is we looked at the commissioning tenders, the ones that we could find available to us going back to 2013, I think it was, or 2012, just after the specific duties that came in from the Equality Act. So we knew that there was a justification for that to be included within the tenders. The first two bullet points, or the first three, are just really about the scope of the tenders, and usually large tenders which are available. So obviously it makes it more difficult to smaller organisations, of which BME organisations comprise quite a lot. Makes it more difficult then to apply. But the two main points really from this one was how the majority of the documents paid little reference, if none, to BME groups or the public sector equality duty. So yeah, they're the main points that came from the commissioner findings. It was quite difficult to get all of the information from the commissioners because the scoping of the commissioners' research bit took place just as COVID was kicking off, whereas the findings from the advocacy groups took place just before. So these are some of the findings that came from the advocates, service users, but also what was found in other pieces of research that looked at this issue. So back in 2017, I was involved in something called a Black Voices research project that was going into secure care around the country. But then we also looked at research which was being carried out by a lady called Karen Newbigam at Birmingham University. So she's done quite a lot in this area. So I'll go through these one by one, but the first one is advocacy outcomes identified by BME communities extend beyond a narrow focus on detention to include addressing welfare issues, social disadvantage, racism, and their civic status. And what was coming from this really, and it is the highlight that some of the issues that BME people are facing are really not being taken into account within the advocacy services that were being provided. There seemed to be a narrow focus of what they were being offered. Western conceptualizations of mental health and illness and conceptualizations of advocacy are dominant, but the understanding of mental health distress differs for BME communities, and it was felt that it wasn't always understood. And this is quite a packed comment really, but there was an idea that the mainstream model will not always have race and racism as a main issue. The habitude, if you like, of the organisation had already been set. And there was a sense that, you know, some of the way that equality and diversity was viewed was sometimes quite superficial. There was an understanding of maybe formal equality, but not substantive, substantive in the way that we would understand something like equity. And there's also questions about models of advocacy being based on what Western ideas of advocacy are, and real need to explore what advocacy might be for non-Western people. And this is a point that I'll come to a little bit later, which draws on ideas of collectivism and activism. We didn't find this within our own research, but this was one from something that Karen Newbigin found. But there was additional pressures. BAME advocates faced additional challenges in undertaking their roles. Sometimes they felt that they were having more pressure put on them to deal with just the black groups, but they also felt that they felt pressure because of the way mental health practitioners viewed them and treated them. And the last bullet point on this one is BAME community organisations are grounded in a concept of empowerment. So there's this and work to build social capital, and they play a critical role in addressing social disadvantage and the adverse pathways and outcomes in relation to mental health care. So this is really fundamental in terms of we think about how an organisation is built up and the philosophy and upon which it operates, and how that may be different than what would be a mainstream model which was set up many years before. So 4 more findings really in relation to this. This wasn't from our own one, this was from research again by Karen Newbigin, but those in need of mental health services are the most likely to access it, and this included BAME groups. I think more work needs to be taken to identify whether this is still the case. That the data on this is really weak, but that was one of the findings that they found from a bit of a scoping review. I think this was about 8 years ago or something like that. I think this next point is absolutely crucial, and it was one of those points that people reflected on quite a bit, but it's ethnic identity creates a sense of shared understanding and can facilitate access to advocacy services, and that shared identity and that conversely can act as a barrier to access in mainstream services. There's this idea, and it's gone on for a long time, that if you have an Asian advocate, then that Asian advocate is best positioned to serve Asian inpatients. But we know that there's clear examples of that where that's to the contrary. I mean, I know from my experience of doing community advocacy in London, where I had a lot of Tamil people, and many of them didn't want to see a Tamil practitioner or a Tamil advocate purely because there was issues around confidentiality. But there is another side to this that we really need to think about as well, where the evidence suggests that this idea of racial identity, ethnic identity really can create a sense of shared understanding. And for some people who spoke to me, it really did. They said it meant the world to them that they've seen a black face within the ward that they were on. That wouldn't be the case in some wards where there's a lot of black people, but in other days it would. But I mean, there's other evidence that I think we need to consider. And it's, you know, there's research which shows that, you know, white people are less comfortable talking about racism than our black groups, and that's not everyone. That's not every white person, but you know, they've done research where they've showed white groups have had higher heart rates when the issue of racism has come into the topic. But there's also, and I was speaking to Kate about this a number of months ago, there's neuroimaging studies now which pulls away from just a psychological position of understanding this importance of identity and the ethnic matching to a biological understanding, whereby we have greater neurons running through certain parts of the brain as we actually engage with different groups, and when white groups are more alert when speaking to someone of the same racial identity, and conversely that's the same for black groups. So I think these understandings need to be taken into play when we think about how we deliver services. Last 2 bullet points on this is that in terms of, we know there's a big problem in terms of having the availability of different language services. This was highlighted in the review, and it's something that obviously needs to look at. But it's important to not get distracted by the issue of language when we've got third generation young black people who can speak English quite clearly, who have much poorer outcomes in relation to mental health services. And the last point is the importance of being able to build trust and relationships was particularly relevant to BME groups, and that's a point I will reinforce very shortly when we start to look at culture in relation to advocacy and culturally appropriate advocacy. So, next slide. Okay, so thinking through a model of culturally appropriate advocacy service. So in 2018, let me just check the clock, 1:30. Okay, in 2018, I was involved in developing a training package, and a lot of the hurdles which was for culturally appropriate advocacy, and a number of the hurdles that we had to overcome when we were doing that, I think are relevant, and these are some of the ones that I want to share with you, because when we were developing it, we're thinking, how does this help to mitigate bias at different levels? And that was a real theme that we continue to look at. The model that we put together was completely co-produced. We had AMPs involved, and what was fundamental to me was you had people who'd had a racialized lived experience, but it was a number of people who'd, well, been through the mental health system. So that was absolutely key to it. The co-production. So I think there's a lot of confusion over different terms in this area, and I don't want to spend too long on it because I think I'm talking too much as it is. But the idea of culture appropriate advocacy, it hasn't come from nowhere. It hasn't just appeared from nowhere. It stems from and builds on ideas around cultural competency. There's a much bigger literature in relation to cultural competency. There we go. This is something that we drew upon when we were developing the different models, and these are some of these ideas here overlap, but there's more similarity than overlap. So culturally adapted, for instance, this would form part of a cultural competent model, but culture adapted is where clinical interventions are typically where ethnic matching takes place. There may be slight changes to the processes, but I feel there's ideas that within each of these which are transferable to advocacy, and I'll start to explore them shortly. I mean, the idea of cultural safety and cultural competence, they also overlap. Some people have said that safety, it doesn't place an emphasis on developing competence. So somebody has wrote about this. It doesn't not an emphasis, on developing knowledge. It's more around recognizing social, historical, political, and economic circumstances that create power differences. My position is that these can be part of skills that would fall within a competency framework, and it would encompass the need to be self-reflexive. The other issue is that the cultural safety approach was developed in New Zealand, where the diversity there, with it kind of being by two main populations, and not the same as what we've got within the UK context. So it has a different relationship when we're thinking about the determinants of mental ill health. So the reason, one of the things, many of the problems I found when reviewing this literature and relating to advocacy, there's two main issues here that emerged. Here the issues are focusing on improving the experience of mental health services for BME people, and there's clearly a model here when we think about race and ethnicity, because all of these aspects mention culture. It's all about culture, which kind of deviates from having a focus on race and racism. And we measure, it's not ethnically appropriate, we measure inequalities by ethnicity, not culture. And although the terms overlap, I think it's something that needs to be made clear with any definition, and that's not always clear in the definitions which are actually out there. So, and the other problem with all of these models is that they all relate to healthcare providers, not advocates. So that's one of the things that we wanted to do, was take the components of these and then translate them onto advocacy services. So I think this next part really is starting to question why, the categorization of terms that we actually, it's something that we have to have as our base standard level. And I don't believe that's always the case in terms of how we look at how inequalities manifest themselves. So, and the reason I want to spend a bit more time on this is because there's certain ideas that people have when they talk about culture, and I don't think it really always goes far enough. So, I mean, race is quite clear here is, you know, it's something that's based on physical appearance, phenotype differences, you know, skin color, hair type, and racism takes place because of those reasons. You also have cultural racism, but the reason I'm mentioning it is because of the idea that culturally appropriate advocacy should also include that focus on addressing race and racism, not just on being aware of cultural differences. Ethnicity is just someone's sense of belonging, how they see themselves, and it is a mixture of culture and race. Now, but culture itself, when I don't know about what you think, but whenever I spoke with people as part of the review, not everybody, and when you look at a lot of opinions on this, a lot of people see culture as being about, you know, someone's music, they like the music they like, the clothing, the dress they wear, the food they'd like to eat. Sometimes they'll talk about religion, and sometimes they'll talk about language differences, and it means so many different things, culture. But I think what's most pertinent, not most pertinent, but one of the key things that's often overlooked, or which you need to consider with any model of how we operate, is what culture means in terms of values. So, you know, to me, it's and this is why it's so relevant to advocacy, because it talks about ideas about rights. It talks about ideas about what justice is, what we accept and what we reject. I mean, culture, it's a fuzzy set of basic assumptions and values, but it does inform our orientations to life. It's part of our beliefs, it's part of policies, procedures, and it influences each member's behaviour and their interpretations of other people's behaviour. I want to make it quite clear as well that I don't see it as being deterministic. There will be people within a certain population group who will have certain cultural differences, but not everyone will be thinking in that way. So it's multi-layered dimensions, and it interacts with class, religion, and so on and so on. But it has quite a significance for mental health services. From a health perspective, which I don't want to draw on too much, but it is absolutely vital. It informs the type of care that a person expects to receive. It informs whether they decide to access care at all. There's evidence to show that it also links to pain thresholds and so on. But here, thinking specifically about advocacy, it's like I say, it's not just food, it's not dress, it's not language, it's ideas about what's right, what is fair, and what is just, and what is unjust. And I mean, I was thinking a couple of days ago, I mean, I don't know if you looked at data looking at the O.J. Simpson murder trial, at that time, before, during, and immediately after, 20% of African Americans thought that O.J. was guilty. So 80%, approximately 80% thought that he was not guilty. Those statistics were almost completely the opposite way around for Anglo-Americans. And these differences don't just play out in the UK context, but they're born out in the cultural beliefs here in the UK. And there's a guy called Paul Burrell who has large companies. He's wrote a book, and they approach him, you know, to expand so they can expand their marketing into black communities. So I mean, when I spoke to a lot of service users, and they talk about how when a black advocate comes to them and they say, well, they get me, they understand where I'm coming from. And this isn't all the time, but it happens more often than not. But there's a convergence of ideas and beliefs that are demarcated along ethnic boundaries. I mean, if you look, there's research which shows that black parents are more likely to talk to their children at a much younger age than other ethnic racial groups about race. This is culture. There's lots of evidence that shows black groups generally have lower levels of trust in public officials. This is culture, which is so vital to understanding how someone will engage with advocates, with mental health services. There's a really interesting study, I think it was late 90s, early 2000s, by Gilvari, and it showed how Asian, white and black groups all interpreted negative life events quite differently, and how those groups, some groups were more likely to interpret those events as being caused by racism. So these beliefs exist, and they inform how someone interacts with services. But there's other more important ones which relate to the advocacy provision as well. I mean, there's interesting psychosocial studies, if you like, which show the importance of collectivism within black groups and Asian groups as well, and more generally within non-white groups. Their preference in different studies was to show that they wanted to cooperate whereas the white groups would actually, there's more a greater sense of individuals and not wanting to cooperate. So there's these collectivism ideas are probably quite important for understanding how we deal with advocacy and thinking, okay, should it be group advocacy or should it be one-to-one? How do we start to take into account these different factors? And there's lots more in terms of how, you know, some racialized minority groups will find that, you know, feel more emotional and have more mental health challenges because of racism that takes place in society, which is actually not directly affecting them at that moment in time. This very quickly, this is one study that was carried out, you know, I don't think it was the best study because it wasn't comparative, but it just showed how culture informs expectations. So, you know, this was in The Guardian about a couple of weeks ago, I think, but 3 in 4 Black people do not believe that their human rights in general are equally protected compared with white people in mental health services. So I think for me, what I wanted to do was illustrate the importance of culture and how we really should have a much stronger understanding of it and its relation to when we give advocacy support. Now, I mentioned before that there's a number of different cultural competency frameworks, different ideas have been developed. The slide, a couple of slides here, we had cultural sensitivity, cultural adaptation. There's over 2,000 papers that I've not all read individually, but reviews of reviews and scopings and so on. But what I did is took the components from each one and started to define what each one had in common. And every one had, you know, these 4 components really, that there was a human difference that they wanted to be able to deal with or to support or make sure that there wasn't an inequality there. Some of them went on, you know, right, you know, for lots more of other areas of person's identity, but for keeping it simple for the purpose of a culture appropriate model that would deal with BAME issues, this, you know, culture, ethnicity, race, gender and socioeconomic, some of the human differences that you could say a culture appropriate or competent framework would need to consider. Then you had an intervention. One of your core factors of each model was that there would be some kind of intervention. And most of them started to work towards addressing changing attitudes, skills and knowledge. They were your competencies, but then there was also ones where you'd see changes in policy and practice. So just as an example of an attitude would be an openness to cultural safety, for instance, an attitude that appreciates how the value of race, ethnicity and culture in people's lives. Knowledge may be, you know, knowledge of legislation, and a skill would then be to the ability to use that. And it's always a skill to be able to identify racism. So, and, you know, these are the kind of competencies. Now, there's hundreds of these competencies, but what we worked on was narrowing that down to around 50. We're still working on that, but there's overlap, but that's a little bit of work in progress. And there was a change. The change, each model, each definition would be looking for a change either at the individual level, the organisation, or both. And the outcome was hopefully to work more effectively in a cross-cultural situation. So we've started to put together a working definition that tries to encapsulate this. And one of the things I found in lots of the models of cultural competency was there was never an idea that this should be ongoing. I mean, being competent suggests that you've already reached this milestone and you know what to do, and that's never going to be the case. And I think it's an unfair aim for someone to be expected to be cultural competent. You may expect an organisation to be, but to expect an individual to know all of these different things about different ethnic groups is completely unrealistic. So we have to accept that there is something here about an ongoing commitment. So cultural competent advocacy entails an ongoing commitment by advocates and organisations to have the right behaviours, attitudes, knowledge and skills and policies, to challenge the abuses of rights and to work effectively in cross-cultural situations. So once we came up with this definition, we started to, as part of that, we were thinking about, okay, how does it actually apply, on which levels are we mitigating bias at? And I see it as being at least 3 levels. We have the level of the advocate, there's obviously the advocate's organisation, but then there's also the healthcare provider, and it was the healthcare provider where I found that most advocates really weren't thinking about. They weren't thinking about, you know, the way that the healthcare provider operates in a very discriminatory way at different points in time. In a positive way, they were thinking about how they could adapt their own service or how they could adapt the bias that they have within themselves. Now, I mean, I've put this at 3 different levels here, but, you know, if you look at other models, there's a lady called Coretta Phillips who did an expanded framework where she adds another level where it considers macro processes like neoliberalism, public sector managerialism. But I've tried to keep this. I mean, there's obviously a commissioner level, which is quite vital to this, which I haven't put in. But what we'll notice as we go through the next couple of slides is there's a strong interaction between the level of the organisation, the advocacy organisation, and the advocate. So, I mean, my emphasis as we go through the next couple of slides will be on looking at. Sorry, okay. Well, let me go back to the previous one. My emphasis on the next couple of slides will really be around the advocacy organisation and how you can start to think and interrogate some of the practices of it to look for where bias actually takes place. But that's not to say that attention shouldn't really be focused on looking at the other areas. I mean, if I give an example from outside of the mental health field, just to help with this one a little bit, to illustrate how there's a connection between. I was involved with NOMS about 10 years ago now, and what they had, most people you will know, and I was talking to Kate about this a few weeks ago, is if there's a fracas of any kind within a prison system, you have something called an adjudication. As a result of the adjudication, they decide whether the person's going to go in isolation or not. Now, lo and behold, there was a number of more black people who were actually going into isolation than the non-black group. And when we started to really look at this, there was so many different factors that were connected to it. But what we asked them to do was just add 3 questions into that process and to make that process race conscious, and to ask, has this factor included, you know, has the decision involved a consideration of the person's race? And when that happens, some of those inequalities actually started to reduce. And this was because of you started add individuality into it and you request concrete examples. We know there's evidence which says that, you know, when white and black groups have been asked to rate the weight and height and strength of black and white people, like, even though the black and white person is the same height and weight, they've always rated the black person as being taller and heavier. In other studies where the people have you know, been asked to perceive whether something was more violent or not, the same behavior has always been constructed as more violent. So there was a test, there's a famous one by Duncan in the US, where there was a fabricated show, and where the black person hit the white person, and the same action was carried out whether the white person onto the black. But all the people who out of all the people who rated it, 75% of those rated the black behavior as violent, whereas only 17% rated the whites as for the same action. So there's ways that we rate things, and this is the bias that obviously operates at the individual level, which we can't ignore. It's there, it exists. The next example that I really want to go through is one that starts to look at how there's a bit of interaction between the advocacy level, the individual advocate, and the organisation. I mean, I haven't spent so much on the healthcare provider level, but I think there's an awful lot of work that can be taken there. And I know there's a presentation on Thursday, I think, which will be looking at judicial review. There's lots of concerns I have around how organisations produce their objectives and things like that, and not knowing really what they're doing in that area. So this example here looks at when you're trying to see how bias operates within an organisational practice. So one of the things that was shared to us as part of the research was how participants, which included advocates and service users, shared how there was the increase of pattern of advocacy services where they providing this issue-based model, where you have some of the organisations where you have 2 hours, you've got to go in, provide the service, and then then the job's done, or maybe not done. But there's the idea is that you have 2 hours to carry out that issue. There was also combined with that sometimes the idea that referrals were actually led by the nurse, or telephone-based referrals. Now, I think it's possible to accept that in some areas advocates can't be on the wards in all of the different places purely because of geography, and that is the case across a number of different parts of the country. But when I was looking through this, I could find no I mean, it's a public authority requirement to do this, but I could find no quality impact assessments about the possible differential impact this type of model may have on different groups. But there was a feeling that from advocates that there was a service philosophy that, as I say here in the bullet, that moderated the ability of the advocate to work and build professional relationships and build trust. If you're not on the wards and you're not meeting people, then you don't have that opportunity all the time. And there was concerns about, you know, I think I mentioned it in the next bullet point. Okay, it was felt that telephone-based referrals were less advantageous as they can create multiple barriers. Feedback suggested that the advocacy offer was not always explained concisely or accurately by nursing staff, who can also sometimes dissuade service users from seeking representation. And this was coming out. This is something that was fed back to us by service users and advocates. So these barriers that exist there, and these barriers will exist for all inpatients. The question is if you started to do an equality impact assessment and really thought through about that practice, would there be a differential impact? And that's something that, you know, we started to think about. I think it's something that everyone needs to think about within their own practice. So, I mean, we found that a couple of service users, more than a couple, but we found that in one part of the country in London, service users approached a community-based advocacy organisation for support on a ward situation. That was rather than focusing approaching the funded IMHAR organisation, because they'd never met the funded IMHAR organisation, yet the community organisation made itself present on some of the wards, and they could see that there was a relatability there ethnically. Two individuals went to organisations partly because of the language barrier, something that we kind of know, we know something that we need to do something about. But others stressed that they did not access IMHAR until they saw somebody of their own racial identity, or because they anticipated the service would not be able to help them. And this was quite common amongst a number of different service users, how they felt that some advocacy wouldn't be able to deal with the issues that they'd actually be bringing forward. So we can start to think already that there's likely to be a differential impact here because of a general policy or a general provision that has been provided to everyone. And the last bullet point, but BME service users also highlighted the need for face-to-face contact, finding it more helpful to establish trust and build relationships. These were factors they deemed especially important, given the lower level of confidence in the mental health system. And this is, I think, if we start to go back to the data and the evidence around and the studies that have been taking place around the lack of trust people have, particularly some BME groups within the mental health system. And they don't always differentiate between advocacy and a mental health provider. They sometimes see them as part of the whole system. So when you have that lack of trust, or the lower levels of trust, when you have that lower level of confidence, and when you feel, you know, when you've had a pretty difficult life and you feel like you may have been treated differently because you're race across all of those areas, like there are these barriers that are created, which you then start to ask, okay, is there another barrier? And for me, when you look at that, it does create an additional barrier. Now, not everyone, but a lot of people balk when they hear the idea of institutional racism. And I think, for me, I think everyone has racist beliefs. And I think if the country has come to a position where people are afraid, and it's the worst, most toxic thing to be called a racist. And I know myself, I've operated in racist ways. And I think it's one of the things we all need to be a lot more honest about. But if we think about this practice of issue-based support, and also support where it's nurse-led or clinician-led referrals, whatever it may be, or telephone-based only referrals. And it'd be interesting to see what's happened as a result of COVID, where that's been the norm rather than the exception. But when you look at the definition from Macpherson, is that service appropriate to everybody's culture, or is there an unwitting practice, or as he puts it, an unwitting prejudice which has a disadvantage on minority ethnic people? And I feel like sometimes I need to repeat that. Sometimes people do fear this label of institutional racism because of the toxicity that attached to it, but I find it a useful framework for really exploring how our services are actually operating and whether they're operating to the advantage of the people who are the recipients. And that there's some just concluding remarks really, but quite short. But what the evidence shows across a number of areas, that people are more likely to seek help if they believe their cultural beliefs are considered and taken into account. That more relates to health interventions, but I can't see why it'd be too different for other forms of services. And one of the things that I've tried to repeat throughout is that actions need to be grounded in the evidence, and there's a need for serious reflection on practice. And this isn't the time for knee-jerk reactions. It's one for really looking at the different elements of our services to see, and that's every aspect, top to bottom, to see how they operate and whether there's any differential impact in the way they do. Not looking for a standalone magic bullet that that will deal with everything. That this is about probably a patchwork of different solutions to be able to deal with what is a very complex problem, a complex problem that we still haven't found a way of addressing people's prejudice. So we have to take steps to try and mitigate it, which is the point that I really wanted to bring out. But I think my last point is I see the role of advocates as absolutely central to challenge and bias. If we think right across a person's journey through services, there's a number of points where people have discretion to make decisions about an advocate's, about a service user's life. And so many of them decisions are just completely discretionary. And one thing that we know about equality from all of the studies is where you have the broadest case for discretion, that is typically where the biggest inequalities can be found. And I think our advocates are on the coalface in trying to be able to address some of that. Yeah, and that's my last slide. Sorry for running on because, yeah, I know I haven't got much time.
We've got time for 6 minutes of questions. God, there's so much food for thought, Anthony. Okay, so over to you guys. There's been a few discussion points in the chat box. So if you've got specific questions, do you know what? Could I ask you to put specific questions in the Q&A box? It's just that we tried it in the last session. It was really difficult for me to highlight the questions from the chat. So if you've got a specific question, put it in the Q&A. But yeah, listening to you, Anthony, it made me think that where we're at is a kind of an advocacy community. We're kind of at this stage of just trying to be a bit introspective, I think, and thinking about where we're at. And I loved your points around questioning whether race is playing a part in any of the decisions or experiences of people. And I just wanted to share a little experience of an advocate who was working in a ward, and the person they were advocating, they went to see them, but when they arrived in the ward, they could hear him shouting. Well, when we say shouting, the advocate said that English was a second language and he was struggling with his words. So he was raising his voice to be heard. And then the next minute, the staff kind of piled in, restrained him, he was injected, and then that was it. And the advocate was then reflecting on what part did race play in that? And would that have happened if English wasn't his first language or if he was white? And I think that was such a great kind of place to be, and then questioning things and having that insight. Is that the type of thing you think we should be doing?
I think that's part of it, and you see this happen in so many ways, how one person decides to speak to another. So we've had lots of examples. That's one level. So the advocate obviously looking at how a person's being treated and seeing if if there's a likelihood that. So the question is what one thing I've always noticed is when someone's trying to speak with somebody else whose first language isn't English, when they've said something once, they tend to then raise their voice and then raise their voice again and then raise their voice, hoping that just because you're saying it louder, they will hear them, even though they're standing in front of them. And that's not, would they do that if that was an English person? I don't know if they would, but I think we need to start creatively and challenging those types of actions. I think they're important because I think that's where bias seeps in. I mean, we've seen similar examples of that where there was an Asian person who was praying, and he was praying quite a lot, and he started to increase the amount that he was praying, and there was concerns raised of a prevent-related nature of radicalization, but it was simply because this person at that point in his life was having more thoughts about his mental health problems, so he was praying to God more and more. But how that was constructed was completely different from one to the next. And in that position, the advocate played an absolutely valuable role in questioning that type of behavior and those type of assumptions. Yes, yeah. But I think there's so many decision-making points where bias creeps in, and what we try to do is, myself and a couple of colleagues, is map all of them out, because I think once we start to pinpoint them, we start to hopefully make things a little bit better. Yeah.
Okay, can I take a couple of questions in the Q&A now? So Pete's asked, do you think bias extends to becoming a disincentive for people from different cultures to become advocates?
Does bias create a disincentive for people to become advocates? Is that?
Yeah. So you can read it, if you click on the Q&A, you'll see it's on the third one down.
I'm not getting this questions.
Okay, I'll read it.
Oh, Pete Dempsey, is it?
Yes.
Sorry, yeah, okay. I don't know. I mean, we were training some peer support for people who'd been through the mental health system, who had a racialized life experience, and they wanted to be advocates because they wanted to do something so nobody else experienced that kind of situation that they've had. So based on, I could only base it on what I've seen and from what they've told me, but it takes me back to this idea about collectivism. So when you often speak, this relates to peer support work as well, but when something happens to an individual and it relates to racism, there's this idea that it isn't just one person that they want to support and make better, but they want to, that to be the same and nobody else to experience it. So I think it depends on who's wants to be the advocate and their identity, because that's absolutely vital to understanding that.
Pete's followed up with a comment that says it's been quite challenging or difficult to recruit from different cultures, people from different cultural groups.
I mean, yeah, this is quite an interesting one, and I suppose it looks at how you recruit, so and what's actually taking place. So I think most of you will know there's something called positive action and the extent to which positive action can operate. So it's a completely voluntary measure, positive action, and there's 4 elements to it, and I'm happy to send the paper over which relates to it. But I mean, I'll give you an example what happened in Liverpool, and this was relating to a huge project, the new shopping centre that was built in 2008. Now, generally, a lot of people in Liverpool who are black don't tend to work in a city centre. They tend to do their shopping in places like Manchester, and there's these patterns. Now, they decided to do their recruitment in black organisations in areas like Toxteth and Wavertree. Now, the BME population in Liverpool then was around 5%, something like that. They recruited 18% of BME people to take part in that project. And in organisations like that, what the finding has typically been, and this is the same for the police as well, and I'll give an example from the police in a moment, but the problem hasn't always been recruiting them, it's actually been retention. The issue has been retention, and that's one of the big problems now. I mean, what the police and the College for Policing found when they were trying to address bias in theirs, they found that if they just included simple different letters in their recruitment processes, that they weren't sending to, they did it as a randomized control trial, so it was fairly scientific as you can get for a social study, but they included stuff that was really encouraging in a percentage of the black applicants, the invites towards interviews, and what they found then was that almost reduced the extent to which they passed the next level of their recruitment stage. Now, there was another issue for the next stage of it, and there was a separate issue, and I can't remember, but I can dig it out and find out. But I mean, there's different aspects to positive action. I mean, Liverpool City Council and some other places are looking at apprenticeships now and things like that, which can take place up to a year. But you know, we've done it with getting people into mental health services, and I think it all depends which ethnic groups rather than cultures, I suppose, you're trying to
but it plays to this idea, doesn't it, Anthony, of and as I'm kind of learning more about this, it's about being embedded in communities rather than parachuted in. So, you know, whether that's your recruitment or the access point, it's about being in that community, isn't it?
I think that's absolutely vital for some advocacy models, organisations who are already there, embedded in the community and have set up relationships. And I think that's important for more so for people who have been through the system and going through the system and need that advocacy. Then I don't think they're so great in terms of prevention, but in terms of having them organisations in existence for people who have been through the system and so on, I think they're absolutely vital. And there's lots of examples where I've seen where it's helped to prevent or reduce the number of detentions.
Yeah. And one final point, I'm conscious of time and overrunning too much, but just for all the IMHers on the call, IMHer, and I loved your point around, we've kind of gone down this path of it being issue-based and led by hours. And I just wanted to kind of say to people that nowhere in the Code of Practice, nowhere in the commissioning guidance, nowhere in the primary legislation does it say IMHer has to be a one-to-one relationship focused on issues. Nowhere. That's kind of how we've developed it. And I think a kind of a quick win, if you will, is to think about how you deliver your IMHer and include in models of group advocacy rather than your one-to-one specialist. So you might be thinking about peer advocacy sessions, or, you know, led by people on the wards with your support, where you might not be talking about your one-to-one advocacy issue, but you might be talking about human rights or these broader issues that, because I think on one of your early slides, Anthony, you talked around people wanting more holistic support rather than your traditional, you know, I want an appeal. It might be about employment, or it might be about relationships, or it might be about something, it might be about race or culture. I don't know if you had any thoughts on that.
I think that was something that came up quite a bit, and I think one of the problems that people expressed in relation to the model of IMHAR really, and in and of itself, was that people felt they became quite fixated on the idea of providing people's needs and addressing them in relation purely to IMHAR, but it kind of removed their focus on other areas of rights. So things like discrimination, human rights abuses became less of the focus because it was so entailed around dealing with an IMHAR related issue rather than looking at the intersection of those pieces of legislation. And I don't have the answer to that, but that was just an issue that really came out in terms of what was expressed.
Many ways of addressing this. That's your point, isn't it? That might be one of many. Are we all right to just do two more questions? Are you okay for time?
Yeah. I mean, I'm just looking at Colin Bibby's question, but I mean, we have to understand the cultural differences. Did you know that West Indians, and I think that's an interesting statement. I wouldn't say all West Indians and Africans don't like each other. Well, I mean, and it's quite an important one, really. I mean, one thing those groups share is oppression, racial oppression, and sometimes that provides enough of a connection to be able to deal with some issues. But when I was involved in some other work, what was quite clear is that some people who had been in this country, who were maybe second generation, third generation, whatever it may be, found that people who were coming from Africa had a different viewpoint on around care. So that was nurses, and you know, this is me repeating or paraphrasing what was said, but that, you know, their perception was more of a case of you need to get on with yourself, pick yourself up and get on with it. So what I'm not saying is that what I was trying to make clear within the presentation is that, and I specifically said, is that culture isn't deterministic. It's not everyone within a certain racial or ethnic group who's saying has the same cultural belief. So no, I don't believe all West Indians, which is and Africans don't like each other, but there are things which cross over for sure. And there is that common experience of racial oppression.
Doreen's asked an interesting question at the bottom around, let's have a look. Is it true to see that Black and Asian minority ethnicity is a new favoured categorisation of Black people, but the Black experience is separate and distinct from other groups? any kind of thoughts, and she's asking around statistical and targeted response specifically for Black people in the mental health system.
I don't think, I mean, I think all labels are wrong to use, but we need to somehow find a way of, I mean, I prefer to use racialized minority. It accepts that within the UK context, these people are racialized, where there is a power dynamic which is implicit within the idea of the concept of being racialized. The idea of BME, you know, people continues, there's websites now and things like that. BME is not a word. It is an easy catchphrase, and I should have made clear at the beginning that I don't necessarily agree with it, but it's an easy way of referring to people who have different experiences in relation to services. I wouldn't say it's a favoured categorisation for Black people. No, Black people is often termed within a political sense, but for me, the Black experience is quite distinct from what I can see within the data, at least. And when you look at other studies, it is different. But there is still evidence that other ethnic groups have a more disadvantageous experience. One of the problems we have with the data as well is it only ever seems to look at your main ethnic groups, which is problematic because it tends to rule out Gypsy and traveller population. You have a huge population of Brazilian people in London, yet they had to self-define under the Spanish group or the other group, and how they seen in their rituals and things like this were all quite different in terms of how they viewed mental health. So I don't think any label or construct is ideal, but we need a way of trying to understand the inequalities exist to be able to do something about it. And when you look at a country where, like France, where they say, well, everybody is French and you don't start to monitor these groups, you know there's fundamental inequalities which are taking place, but you can't always do something about them. So I think there's a difficult one to get to grips with. Not get to grips with, but to be able to say one's right and one's wrong. Like for me, I think we need the data. We need to be able to define these different groups to be able to try and do something about it.
Great. God, we could really go for another 6 hours, couldn't we? And I think this is going to be a huge issue over the next year, that, well, not just the next year, but we as advocacy services start to really get their heads around what this means and how we can improve this. So we will definitely have you back, Anthony, if that's all right. And
okay.
Philip has asked if there's any specialist training available, and I guess you're the man, aren't you?
I mean, we've just finished developing a model, a culture appropriate advocacy model of training. It should be, I think, ready to roll, because I think what Kate said earlier is this idea of having things e-learning is now absolutely essential, because we don't know how long things are going to go on. But I think we're looking end of November, maybe early December, when that will be online. So if you drop me an email, then I can definitely send a link over when that's the case, for sure.
Great. I think that's the start of for many. Anthony, thank you so much, as always.
Thanks for the opportunity. All right.
Take care. And thanks everyone for comments and chats. We've had a few questions around, can the slides be available?
Yeah, of course.
Okay,
do they want to just email? I mean, I can send them to you, Kate, or whatever's easiest. I don't know. It's whatever. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Let's do both. And,
all right. Thanks again.
Then.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks again.
Bye now.
Bye, everyone. See you soon. Take care. Right then, so thanks everyone for joining in. We're going to sign off now. We've got another session at 3:30 with Claire from the Equality and Human Rights Commission, looking at a brilliant resource to notify people of their rights, which advocates can use. So for those joining, I'll see you in 20 minutes. Grab a cup of tea. See you soon. Bye.